Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. The internet of sharing, and in fact what Marshall was talking about, that experiences have overtaken stuff as kind of status markers, that's a very real thing. In fact, the UK, I think along with Japan, among the advanced industrial economies, reached a significant point in the last 8 or 9 years where they hit peak stuff, which means that the amount of actual physical things, while the economies continue to grow, the amount of physical stuff in terms of raw materials that they consumed started heading downwards. And I think it's fair to say it's the first time that's happened anywhere since the Industrial Revolution. So it is a significant and important thing. It's also, by the way, a trend heavily predicted in a very good book called The Mating Mind, and an attendant book which is called Spent by Geoffrey Miller, who's an evolutionary psychologist. And he makes the point that humans have evolved to signal desirable qualities in themselves, either as trustworthy companions or trustworthy trading partners, or indeed as mates, potential mates, and they try to signal things like intelligence, openness, conscientiousness. There are the big 6 psychological factors which people are eager to signal. Now, as technology changes, of course, and also as fashion changes, the mode of signaling shifts. Now, a very interesting thing, one of the interesting things I find as an internet commentator being old is that in 1989, I would have known what brand of car and what make of car 15 of my colleagues at least drove. Genuinely, I work in a company of now 1,200 people in the building. I don't know anybody's car apart from my own. You have to know your own because you need to find it in a car park, obviously. I've got a vague idea of the brand of car that a couple of people drive, no more than that. So, something which if you watched films like American Graffiti, what car you owned was pretty much everything, has gone to being more or less irrelevant. Now, qualify that in London among a kind of metropolitan, cosmopolitan crowd. That would still not apply in large parts of the country. People would know what car people owned and they'd care about it deeply. But you do see early signs of this. And so the other thing that's happened is that signaling intelligence, discernment, openness, the power of being able to do that by sharing experiences has gone up by an order of magnitude or so since Facebook and Twitter came along. Now, by the way, I want to caveat that a bit by saying that just as consumer expenditure often has certain bonkers qualities to it, so that it's known as costly signaling in evolutionary biology. It gives rise to things like the peacock's tail. They are meaningful signals precisely because they are expensive, impractical, difficult, and require a lot of resources. I can see some aspects of travel snobbery that aren't all that different from the worst absurdities of conventional consumerism. The worst absurdities of conventional consumerism would be seen if you go and get the FT's magazine that used to be called How to Spend It. Do you remember this? Where you would have sort of £200,000 watches and baths that were hewn out of granite by hand by Lithuanian virgins, or this kind of bonkers end of material consumption is probably mirrored a bit in travel. That actually what we value, what has status value about our travel is not so much how good the place is, but how difficult it is to get to and how few of your friends have been there. So I'll just try a show of hands here. How many people in the audience have been to Latin America, South America, I'll say? Okay, so how many people have been to Machu Picchu? Yeah, there you go. Okay, so about 10 people. How many of you have been to Lincoln Cathedral? Okay, don't put your hand up if you actually live in Lincoln or grew up there. So fewer people in this audience have been to Lincoln Cathedral than have been to Machu Picchu, which suggests that actually the bonkers elements of human signalling aren't completely dead. I haven't been to Machu Picchu. I was invited to go on an Ogilvy meeting and said that it was silly. Because you get altitude sickness, you need to stay in a room that has oxygen pumped into the room. You have to climb to an insane altitude in a completely inaccessible place to see what is essentially a pile of old stones. In fact, but it's the very fact that it's so difficult to get there that gives it remarkable status power and signalling power. For those of you who haven't been to Lincoln Cathedral, you don't get altitude sickness. particularly not if you just take a taxi to the top first. Is a bit of a climb up the hill. You can get there and back in a day from London. It's probably one of the 10 most remarkable buildings in the year, in the world, I would argue. It has a spectacular approach, and yet fewer people in this room have been there than have been to a pile of stones. I'm being a bit unfair, aren't I? But effectively a pile of stones where you could probably learn just as much not by going there, but by recording a program on Sky Plus produced by National Geographic. So there are some, there is some weirdness to human travel, that the status is largely driven by expense and difficulty, not by value. And my brother realised that when he was stuck in a hotel room in Singapore for a weekend, and the TV channel had sorry. Oh, you want to mic me up? Is this dead?
Yes, it is.
It's died, right.
So you don't need to hold it anymore.
Yeah, no, I'm not then. Is that all clear?
Just for the live stream, not internally. So you're going to have to speak.
Right, speak loudly. My brother was staying in a hotel room in Singapore, and there was a competition the TV channel was holding, and the second prize was 2 weeks in Bali, and the first prize was a week in London. Which obviously, if you're a Brit, seems a completely surreal and bizarre competition. But again, the status you gain as a Singaporean from going to London is much higher than the status you gain from going to Bali, even though most of us here in London would regard that as a bonkers order of things. So, I think there is a really, really significant thing. I think there's also a big problem, which is that if genuinely more and more people gradually are choosing experiences over stuff, it does have implications for things which are very difficult to change, like the shape of work and the length of the working week and the amount of vacation people get annually. So an interesting fact, I have never met anybody in Europe, nobody, literally, who is so bonkers and right-wing that they think that the UK ought to go and have just 2 weeks annual holiday rather than 4 or 5 because you'd gain an extra 2% of annual GDP. I've never met any single person ever who believes that. And yet in the whole of the US, if you take more than 1 week's holiday at a time, you're regarded as lazy. Okay? Where there's only one man has ever raised the issue trying to get a mandatory 2 to 3 weeks paid vacation for everybody in America. That was Bernie Sanders, and when he raised it in Congress, he was treated as if he was completely deranged. And so there's an interesting question there. If you ask Americans individually, 65% of them would like less money and more holiday. But it's a coordination problem, which is that if you're the person in the office who starts talking this up, you become known as the lazy guy. And there's a fundamental problem. I would argue that, one of the reasons, if you look at consumption patterns in the 1970s, if you look at consumption patterns in the 80s, as Marshall pointed out, generally people worked hard so they could own stuff. And in fairness, that wasn't totally irrational, because there was a lot of stuff back then that you could buy and own that made a significant difference to your life. Washing machines were much more expensive, dishwashers were expensive, everything to do with home appliances was pricier. And also those things were, a television was a pretty expensive thing and it wasn't that good. Now, most possessions are kind of affordable to people in the top half of the earning bracket, I think. I think it's fair to say most things you don't. The other interesting thing when you think about it is that the number of categories of thing that you'd like to own that you can't afford is quite small. Now, I'm not saying if I gave you more money, you wouldn't buy things you wouldn't otherwise buy. You'd probably buy a larger house would be the first default, okay? But people might, they might buy slightly more expensive cars and televisions. Now, contrast that, say, with 1920 or 1930. My grandfather was a doctor in a Welsh mining town. There were effectively, my father listed them once, sort of 20 categories of things that my grandfather could own that the surrounding populace couldn't. You could own a car, you could own a washing machine, he owned the 4th dishwasher in Wales, actually, good claim to fame. You could buy spirits, for example. A bottle of reasonable whiskey was a week's salary to a Welsh miner in the 1920s. Okay? And there were, you could travel abroad. There were huge lists of categories of things that wealthy people could own and buy, televisions, radios, etc., which other people couldn't. And broadly speaking, that doesn't seem to apply anymore. Now, you could argue maybe that's a complete failure in innovation. But the things that are being introduced are increasingly things which are shared. The innovations, I think that point about things that we share is a really, really important point.
Nobody actually wants to have an in-house chef. They want to have more restaurants. You know, none of the things we see as life improving really are anymore. You know, the things we look forward to in the shape of innovation, none of them are really things that we own for ourselves. They're things we can use which we in some shape or form share with other people. Now, it's a strange concept to look at a restaurant as like a sharing economy version of an in-house cook, but that's exactly what they are. That raises interesting questions, actually. One, do you need more redistribution of wealth? Because actually, in a sharing economy, what you want is a lot of people around you who are slightly poorer than you, but not much. Because if they share the same tastes and do the same thing, then you will have lots and lots of things available that, you know, you both can enjoy. Maybe at different times of day. You know, maybe it's slightly more expensive to go to a restaurant in the evening than it is at lunchtime, but nonetheless there's an interesting economic argument that wealth equality, I think, is quite important to an effective sharing economy. If you have huge disparities of wealth, it probably doesn't work very well. So that's one interesting thing. A lot of this experiential stuff is travel, and it interests me particularly because I think that the travel and hospitality sector and the entertainment sector have been revolutionized by digital technology more than anything else in many senses. And part of the reason is, by the way, that it's not only that usual sort of technological evangelism you hear. It's impossible to, if you're under 35 or 40, it's impossible to realize how crap traveling was in, say, 40 or 50 years ago. So you had to go to a travel agent who would show you sort of brochures of places. There was no other form of exploring. Okay? If you wanted to find out where I lived, the times of the trains from Newport in Gwent to London, so, you know, about the most banal travel inquiry you can imagine, okay? When do the trains leave for London from Newport? You rang, I'm not making this up, I promise. You rang a pre-recorded number where a voice read out all the train times. They'd say, leaving at 10:14, arriving Paddington at 12:48. Okay? Now, of course, whenever you rang up, it was always 2 or 3 hours later than you wanted to travel, so you had to stay on the line for about another 8 minutes to wait for the person's voice to cycle around back to the time in which you wanted to travel. That's how bad it was. So I think one of the extraordinary things is that what the internet's created is it's created what you might call, in consumer marketing terms, a massive sampling campaign for other places. You can kind of explore them and know a bit about them and kind of make a judgment about them and whether you want to go there before you go. Secondly, I think there are psychological effects which we don't fully understand, but which are made possible by, for instance, I know it sounds very weird, if you can print out your boarding pass 30 days early, as you can with EasyJet. I flew with an airline recently where you could only print out your boarding pass the day before you travelled. It makes you slightly anxious, whereas once you've printed out your boarding pass, you kind of go, yeah, that's fine, that's all sorted now, I can relax. There are elements of payment. I was talking to a friend of mine who's very good friends with a futurologist, and she makes the point about Airbnb, that the completely frictionless payment and the fact that you can rent houses without actually making contact with anybody, without handing over cash, without posting checks, makes the whole thing feel completely different. I mean, this is really in the area of marketing rather than the area of technology, because it's really about deep-set human psychology. Uber, for instance, has two really Uber is an interesting and quite good taxi firm, but for two things. It's the map, which massively reduces the uncertainty of waiting for a cab. I mean, broadly speaking, the human brain really, really hates uncertainty. Previously, you ordered a cab, they told you it was going to come in 10 minutes. You then enter this twilight zone of fear and uncertainty. And why isn't he here yet? They said 10 minutes. Maybe he's parked around the corner. What if he's already gone? Okay? I used to have an account with radio cabs 12 years ago, and if you rang up to inquire as to why your cab wasn't there, I'm not making this up, they said, can you please quote your 11-digit booking number? Okay? Which, of course, was in your phone, which you were holding to your ear. At one point, I made an interesting discovery that if you said to the radio cabs person, who do you think I am, fucking Rain Man, they hung up on you. But But genuinely, I mean, it's impossible to realise one of the reasons for the huge growth in this area is just the extent to which it's been made frictionless and painless. So the futurologist, this is what futurologists do, okay? She owned, about a mile away from home, she owned a geodesic dome in the Arizona desert, which she rented out on Airbnb. The last week, there were people staying there for 3 days. They paid $100 a night to stay in her geodesic dome, and they decided they liked the dome so much they wanted to stay for 5 days instead of 3. A little bim comes through on her mobile phone requesting a 2-day extension. She presses accept, $200 automatically transferred via Airbnb, job done. The people stay for another 2 days. Now, that feels totally different, as she pointed out. She said, for the people purchasing that feels, you almost have a sense of ownership now, because it feels completely different to the feeling you get if you had to traipse over to her kitchen, have a conversation on the phone, and hand over $10, $20 bills. In the same way that Uber feels completely different, because when you finish your journey, you just get out of the car and say thanks. So if Uber didn't have the map, I'm not saying that Uber isn't good in other economic kind of McKinsey-ish ways. I'm just saying if Uber didn't have the map, and if Uber made you pay in cash and ask for a paper receipt, it would have gone nowhere. The real magic is in surprisingly small little psychological things. I think there's a lot further we can go, actually, in understanding this. I think that I think there's a very, very big opportunity psychologically, and I'd love to chat to you about this, actually, in what you might call creating both a legal and a psychological halfway house between ownership and just straight-out renting. So areas where you have a kind of relationship where you pay an annual fee, and that gives you the right to use something to a certain degree. I think in travel, I mean, you could say that's timeshare if you wanted to be crass about it. Timeshare died basically because it was taken over by crooks. But I think something where you have a sense of ownership, but where your usage is partial, I think appeals to the human brain in that we still have an instinctive feeling that when we spend money, we should kind of get something, rather than just everything being purely transactional. So I think hacking the human brain by creating that feeling of kind of partial ownership, I think is a really interesting area to explore in travel and transportation. I also think it's just interesting because there are one of the things that's very pleasant about this sector is that you have various things, most of all yield management, where you charge people different prices, what you might call EasyJet pricing, or the new railway pricing, where if you travel at a less busy time, you pay a lot less. That's a really, really interesting thing, and one of the reasons it's so important is it's one of the few things you can do in capitalism which genuinely benefits everybody. So if you think about it, it benefits the consumer by and large, because people who've got a lot of time and not much money can do things that they otherwise couldn't afford to do. Cleverest people in the world, by the way, are the Swedes. Do you know why? They take their annual summer holidays, their school holidays, are in July, not in August. So they can tool down to southern Europe and rent villas for bugger all. It's a really, really clever trick. They just shift their holidays, their historical reasons for it to do with the Swedish, I don't know, rye crisp bread harvest or something, which is why their holidays are at a different time of the year. But they have this fantastic yield management bargain. That's why you never complain that the beaches are full of Swedes, okay? It's because they've already been on holiday, and then they spend August running around naked for some reason, which I've never fully understood, back in Sweden. Okay, now, but yield management is interesting because it benefits the seller, it benefits the public, and it benefits the environment. It's something which actually, if done well, in other words, you run fewer trains because the ones that are running are more efficiently used, and it benefits the public because the price they pay can be lower if they're prepared to be flexible, and it benefits the rail company because they make more money than if they had standardized pricing across the board. So it is genuinely a three-way win. I think there are far more exciting and new ways in which people can experiment with yield management pricing. It also redistributes wealth, by the way, invisibly and through entirely voluntary means. I got a friend at the University of Chicago who's an economist who says that actually variable pricing drives about 20% of the wealth redistribution in the United States. The fact that if you're a student or if you're retired, you can just go on holiday at an unusual time, and you can stay in, you can rent villas or you can rent Airbnbs for a fraction of the price that people pay when they're actually in work. That's a really, really important source of wealth redistribution, which we don't notice because we're happy to participate. So I think there's something really interesting there. So I think this is an area where the potential for, if you can get what I call that Venn diagram between technology, economics, and psychology, and you can hit the sweet spot between all three, travel and transportation is a place you can really do that. I was fascinated to see the Starwood effort where you can just check into your own hotel room. You know, my contention is when you can do that, staying in a Starwood hotel feels fundamentally different in the way that Uber feels more like a service and less like a transaction. And I think creating those psychological things around experiences, you know, I think the potential for doing it is vast. But, I mean, I'll just end on a little caveat. We all, because of our age and because of the business in which we work, we tend to be techno-evangelists. We tend to have that slight Silicon Valley ideology, which is that, you know, all automation is good. Wherever possible, you replace a human with an algorithm. We ought to be a bit alert to some of the costs. One of which is that in any sharing economy, you tend to get a winner-takes-all platform. So it tends to create a natural monopoly. Whoever is the most successful automated intermediary disproportionately controls the market, as you know, we see with Uber or eBay. Those are kind of network economies where you tend to get a natural monopoly, so we need to be really, really alert to that kind of thing. Why, by the way, Airbnb became the huge success, rather than, say, earlier people like VRBO or Home and Away, I don't quite know, by the way. I mean, we were chatting about this earlier. They just went for a hip vibe, which just changed the whole feeling of what you were doing, I think. But that's a very interesting case of what you might call the opposite of first mover advantage, late mover advantage. There are also cases that the Silicon Valley thing tends to drive, you know, it almost has a kind of ideology where anywhere where you can replace a paid human with an algorithm, you are a hero, despite the fact that this creates quite large unemployment. And we ought to remember at some point that those people who are complaining that Airbnb is unfair competition to the hotel trade, which after all has to train staff, employ staff, pay insurance, and put up with a whole load of regulatory issues which Airbnb doesn't. We genuinely react badly to those people, just as we react badly to the people who opposed Uber, okay? But always remember they do have a point. Okay? You became a black cab driver in London, and the implicit promise was that you spent 4 years doing the knowledge, and you would end up with a kind of monopoly of on-street collection. And let's be absolutely candid. I'm not one of nature's Luddites, but they were kind of harshly treated. You know, there was an implicit promise which was kind of broken because of a technological loophole. So we ought to be a bit alert to this. The other thing to be careful of, and I'll end with a very good book recommendation. For anybody who's interested in this, read a book called The Middleman Economy, which is written by a Russian-American. And she's a very, very clever economist who understands there's a sort of Silicon Valley obsession with always getting rid of middlemen. And she explains that middlemen who tend to be derided because they apparently make money while not actually making anything do have an extraordinary value, which isn't always well understood by the people who have kind of theories of perfect frictionless efficient markets. Not least, for example, if you imagine a classic middle person, which is a wedding planner, okay? Generally, people only get married once. It'd be very, very easy for a florist to rip off the bride or bride's mother, because generally speaking, I don't want to make a generalization, but someone planning a wedding and completely bonkers people are two Venn diagrams with quite a high level of overlap. Is that fair? Okay? Right? But you know, it'd be very, very easy for a florist to actually rip off a single bride or bride's parent, but the wedding planner is a source of regular repeat business, and you have to deal with them fairly. So it's a very interesting economic book, but it's also interesting if you're fascinated by this whole area of trust, and you made the point that the sharing economy rides on trust. There's some very, very interesting examples of what, say, OpenTable had to do to generate trust. One of the great problems with OpenTable was rival restaurants booking tables through OpenTable at their competitor's restaurant in order to stiff their Saturday night takings. And the very, very clever stuff you had to do to overcome this kind of thing including part of the value of the loyalty program with Open Table was simply to encourage people to keep a stable identity. You made the point that stable identity is one of the absolute essentials of trust. And so without a loyalty program, people would just basically dick around with a restaurant and then reinvent themselves under a new name next week. So their bad behavior never came to light. And so it's a very, very interesting book on understanding the dynamics of what you might call two-sided markets. So a wedding planner and a pimp are effectively the same, by the way, in their economic function. If you boil it down to the absolute essentials, it's the same kind of thing. So, I mean, I do find this area fascinating. I find the potential psychology, I mean, the psychology of travel. I mean, when I gave that warning about Machu Picchu, I think I've got a point, haven't I? Would anybody be really cynical? And I know there are people from British Airways and Intercontinental Hotel Group, and I don't want to skew your whole business. In all the holidays I've taken, though, I don't notice much correlation between how much I spend or how far I go and how enjoyable it is. But we do seem kind of driven. You know, there does seem to be this competitive drive, which I think is partly driven by Facebook, that broadly speaking, having a picture of your tanned legs, in the middle of a rainforest somewhere, just scores you vastly more brownie points than doing the same thing at Ramsgate, okay? And so, there is, it's worth remembering that this form of human signalling, although it's possibly potentially more environmentally friendly, does have its own level of excess, just as consumerism has its own level of excess. And the endless quest for novelty at some point gets a bit silly. France is actually quite nice. I hate to say this kind of stuff. But it is, what I find so interesting about this is that it is proof, the fact that the UK and Japan reached peak stuff, and while their economies continue to grow a bit, the volume of raw material and energy consumed went down, does actually present hope for us all. And that is absolutely a real thing. And so I think that, now, the final thing I'd add is that I would argue, I mentioned this whole business of how much vacation people have. If you wanted to win the US presidential election, I would propose, whoever you are, if you proposed 4 weeks vacation, you wouldn't get any backers from big business. If you proposed 4 weeks vacation in the US, you would win. Okay? And there is a really vital point to be made which no one's actually asked. Occasionally, quite often in fact, I work in the morning from home, and then I take a train which is practically empty at 9:30 and get into the office at about 10:15. And people say, why do you do that? And I say, if I didn't do that, there would have been no point in inventing the internet. Okay? What's the point of inventing the internet if my commuter patterns are identical to that of a Victorian clerk? Where you travel in on the same train every single day. What's the point of technology if we fundamentally don't change our behavior in reaction to it? And we seem to have got past a point where we want to buy things to keep at home, and to arrived at a point where we want to go places and experience things. And at some point, someone will have to have the debate that maybe what is scarce now is not so much money and stuff, it's free time, and we need to create more of it. That then, in areas such as the 24-hour city, should we work 4 9-hour days in a place like London, rather than 5, 7 or 8 hour days? Someone at some point has got to actually raise this question, because it seems to me that you could improve the quality of life far more by effectively just changing the time patterns of human work and leisure than you could by gaining another 2% of GDP. Because GDP measures experiences really, really badly. It's wonderful if you want to measure material stuff. I noticed that EU rules changed so that in Italy they're allowed to include drug dealing and prostitution as part of their GDP. That seems to be a bit dubious if you can include things that are pretty bad. But nonetheless, I mean, GDP is a terrible way of measuring the value of an experience. The sharing economy probably doesn't figure on it at all. If you actually barter with people or swap things with people, that has no material effect on the GDP of a country, even though it obviously improves the quality of life significantly. So at some stage, I think we've got to get ourselves away from the standard economic measurement towards something that's a bit more human and a bit more real. So that's me. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.